The metal hit the saloon floor with a sound like a gunshot, and every man in the room went still. Gertrude Finley had not meant to throw it. Her hand had simply opened, and the bronze disc with its engraved longhorn and the words "Trail Boss of the Territory, 1878, had fallen from her fingers and skittered across the warped floorboards until it stopped at the boots of the man who had earned it. Homer Shepard did not look down at it. He looked only at her, and his gray eyes held something she had never seen in them before. Not the cool, commanding distance he wore like a second skin. Not the careful blankness he used when the cattle buyers came around and tried to undercut his prices. What she saw now was raw and exposed, like a wound reopened, and it frightened her more than anything the frontier had thrown at her in 3 years of living at the edge of civilization. "You kept this from me," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. 3 months, Homer. 3 months of riding beside you, of cooking over your fire, of watching you push yourself past every reasonable limit a man possesses, and you never once told me what happened at the Cimarron crossing. Gertrude. Her name in his mouth was always different from how anyone else said it. Lower, more careful, like he was handling something breakable. "Do not say my name like that," she told him. "Like I need to be managed. Like I am one of your cattle that has gotten spooked and needs to be walked back to the herd." Behind her, she was dimly aware of the other drovers finding reasons to look elsewhere. Old Pete, who had worked with Homer for 9 years, stared into his whiskey glass with the intensity of a man studying scripture. The barkeep, whose name she had never learned because he had never offered it to a woman traveling alone, began polishing the same section of bar with devoted attention. Homer Shepard, the most decorated trail boss in the territory of Kansas, crouched down slowly and picked up his medal. He straightened. He set it on the bar beside her untouched glass of water. "You asked me what it costs," he said. "Back in Abilene, first day we met, you asked me what it costs a man to drive 3,000 head of longhorns from Texas to Dodge City and back again. And you laughed," she said. "I did. You laughed and said it costs about 4 months of your life and a pair of good boots. That is what I said. And it was a lie." He was quiet for a long moment. The piano player, who had been noodling through something cheerful in the corner, let his hands drop from the keys. The room had that particular kind of silence that forms around something true. "Yes," Homer Shepard said at last. "It was a lie." Gertrude Finley had arrived in Abilene, Kansas, on the 14th of May, 1879, with $43, a carpetbag containing everything she owned in the world, and a letter of introduction from her cousin Mabel that was addressed to a boarding house that had, as it turned out, burned to the ground 6 weeks prior. She was 26 years old, possessed of dark brown hair that refused to stay pinned, and a stubbornness that her mother had always called a character defect, and that her father, before his death, had called her finest quality. She had come west because the East had run out of places to put her. She had been a teacher in Connecticut for 3 years. Then her school had closed. She had been a seamstress's assistant in Philadelphia for 1 year. Then the seamstress had married a man who did not approve of female employees. She had been, briefly, engaged to a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had been pleasant and reliable and utterly hollow at his center, and she had broken that engagement on a Tuesday afternoon in March and spent the following 6 weeks arranging to leave everything familiar behind. The West was supposed to be different. Everyone said so. Everyone said the frontier demanded usefulness over pedigree, that it did not care about your father's profession or your family's standing, that you could make something of yourself if you were willing to work for it. Gertrude had found that to be approximately half true. The frontier did not care about her father's profession. It was, however, deeply interested in the fact that she was a woman traveling without a husband or a male relative, and it expressed this interest in a variety of unwelcome ways. She had been standing outside the burned boarding house, staring at the charred foundation and calculating how long her $43 would last her, when she heard the sound. It was a low, continuous rumble, like distant thunder that did not end, and it came from the south. She turned and saw the dust first, a brown cloud rising against the blue Kansas sky, and then underneath the dust she saw them. Thousands of cattle moving in a mass that seemed to stretch to the horizon, flanked by riders on horseback, and at the front of it all, a man on a gray horse who rode like he had been born in the saddle. She watched him bring 3,000 longhorns into Abilene with the kind of controlled precision that made it look easy, which she would later learn was the most misleading thing about Homer Shepard. He made hard things look easy. It was both his gift and his armor. She had not spoken to him that day. She had found a room at the only remaining boarding house, run by a Mrs. Dollar's Crane who charged twice what the room was worth, and made it clear that she viewed Gertrude's presence as a temporary accommodation rather than a welcome one. But Gertrude had paid, and she had spent the next 2 days looking for work, and on the third day she had found herself at the same long table in the same saloon, where the drovers were celebrating the successful end of their drive, and she had sat down at the only available seat, which happened to be directly across from the trail boss himself. Homer Shepard had looked at her the way men on the frontier looked at women who appeared in unexpected places, not with hostility exactly, but with a careful assessment, as if he were working out what category she belonged to and finding that none of his existing categories quite fit. She had looked back at him the same way. "You are the man who brought those cattle in on Tuesday," she said, because she had never seen the point of starting at the edges of a conversation. "I am," he said. "That is quite a distance to drive cattle. About 800 miles from the home ranch, yes. How long does that take? 4 months, give or take. Depends on the weather, the river crossings, the Comanche situation." She had tilted her head. He was older than her by perhaps 10 years, she thought, which would put him at around 36. His face was deeply weathered, all strong angles and sun-darkened skin, with gray eyes that were the color of the sky before a storm and that held, she noticed immediately, a quality of watching everything at once that she associated with men who had learned to be careful the hard way. He wore his medals on a ribbon across the breast of his jacket, which struck her as unusual. Most men of his type would not have bothered with ceremony. "What does it cost?" she asked. He had paused with his whiskey glass halfway to his mouth. "What does what cost?" "Doing that. 4 months, 800 miles, 3,000 cattle. What does it cost a man?" He had smiled then, and the smile had been warm and genuine but also slightly deflecting, the smile of someone who has a practiced answer ready. "About 4 months of your life in a pair of good boots," he said. And she had known, immediately and instinctively, that it was not the true answer. She had known because she had spent 3 years teaching children, and children gave that same kind of deflecting answer when they had done something they did not want to examine too closely. But she had let it go because she had only just met the man, and because her own situation was pressing enough that she did not have the luxury of pressing others. It was Homer Shepard who had solved her immediate problem, though she had not asked him to. When the supper at the long table was breaking up and people were drifting away, he had stayed, and she had stayed because she had nowhere pressing to be, and somewhere in the next half hour of conversation, he had learned about the burned boarding house and her carpetbag and her $43. He had not been obvious about it. He had simply asked questions. The way she would later learn, he always gathered information, quietly and without telegraphing his intentions. The next morning he had appeared at Mrs. Crane's door and had a brief conversation with that woman that resulted in Gertrude's weekly rate being reduced by 40%. He had also, through some network of acquaintance she did not fully understand, located the editor of the Abilene Chronicle, a man named Hubert Marsh, who was badly in need of someone who could write a coherent English sentence, and had been reluctantly convinced to hire Gertrude on a trial basis. When she had confronted Homer about this interference in her affairs, which she had done because she was not a woman who accepted things without understanding them, he had been remarkably unruffled. "I did not do it for charity," he said. "Hubert Marsh is an old friend and he genuinely needs a writer, and Mrs. Crane was overcharging you by a factor of 2, which she knows and which she only does because she thinks you are temporary. I simply reminded her that you might not be." "And why would you do that?" Gertrude had asked. "You do not know me." "I know you are not temporary," Homer said, as if this were obvious. "Anyone who looks at a burned boarding house and starts calculating instead of crying is not temporary." She had been disarmed by this, which was an unusual experience for her. She covered it by asking him about his plans, and he had told her that he was spending 3 weeks in Abilene handling the business end of the drive, then returning south to prepare for the next season. She had said that was a great deal of riding for a man who had just finished 4 months of the same, and he had given her that smile again, the deflecting one, and changed the subject. She thought about him more than was strictly sensible over the following weeks. She was busy enough. The work at the Chronicle was real work, demanding and interesting, and Hubert Marsh turned out to be a better editor than his initial reluctance suggested. She wrote about the cattle trade, about the town's expansion, about the political negotiations happening between the Kansas settlers and the various tribal nations whose land this had originally been. She wrote about injustice when she saw it, which in a frontier cattle town was frequently, and Hubert Marsh published it with only occasional grumbling about his advertisers. Homer came to find her 3 days before he was due to leave. He came to the Chronicle's small office on Main Street at 4 in the afternoon, knocked on the door frame, and stood there with his hat in his hands in a way that she had not yet associated with him, and that she would later understand was unusual. Homer Shepard did not generally hold his hat in his hands. He was not a man who communicated uncertainty through his body, but he held it then. "I have a proposition," he said. "Come in," she said, and he did, settling his large frame into the small chair across from her desk with the careful deliberateness of a man accustomed to not quite fitting into indoor spaces. The proposition was this. His drives north typically covered the same route, following the Kishom Trail up from southern Texas to Abilene, and the logistics of a drive that size required documentation that he currently handled himself badly. He needed someone to keep records, herd counts, expense logs, route notes, correspondence with the ranchers and the buyers. He had employed men for this in the past and found them uniformly inadequate, mostly because they resented being told what to do by someone who had authority over them, and he was tired of the problem. Would she be interested in the position? Gertrude had sat with this for a long moment. "You want to take a woman on a cattle drive," she said. "I want to take a competent record keeper on a cattle drive," he said. "You happen to be a woman, the cattle will not care. The drovers will care. The drovers care about their wages, their coffee, and whether the cattle are moving in the right direction," Homer said. "They will adapt, and if they do not adapt, then I will handle it and it will not happen again." She had looked at him across her small desk. He looked back. He was not selling anything. He was not charming her. He was simply stating a proposition and waiting to see what she made of it. And there was something in that directness that she found more compelling than any amount of persuasion would have been. "What is the pay?" she asked. He named a figure. It was generous. She negotiated anyway because you always should, and he accepted her counter without blinking, which told her he had expected it. "I will need to clear it with Hubert," she said. "I will not leave him without warning." "Of course," Homer said. He rose, settled his hat back on his head, and moved toward the door. Then he paused. "Miss Finley, I should tell you, the drive goes through some difficult country. There are river crossings that are genuinely dangerous, and the weather on the plains can turn on you without warning. I want you to understand that when I say I will handle problems, I mean it, but I cannot guarantee your safety any more than I can guarantee anyone else's on a cattle drive." "I understand danger," Gertrude said. "I know," Homer said. "That is why I asked you." The drive south began on the 1st of June, and Gertrude Finley learned in the first week that there were 2 kinds of hard. There was the kind of hard that broke you, and there was the kind of hard that revealed you, and a cattle drive was almost exclusively the second kind. The distances were enormous. The sun was relentless. The cattle were, as Homer had promised, entirely indifferent to her gender and mostly just interested in moving forward, eating grass, and occasionally stampeding in a direction nobody had authorized. She had her own horse, a steady bay mare named Clementine that Homer had acquired from somewhere and presented to her on the morning of departure without ceremony. She had ridden before, in the limited way that young women in Connecticut rode, which was to say decoratively and on maintained paths. This was different. This was 12 to 14 hours in the saddle, covering 15 to 20 miles per day, through grass that went as high as the horse's bellies and under a sun that showed no mercy. She documented everything. The herd count, taken at dawn and dusk by two different drovers to catch discrepancies, the water sources and their reliability, the condition of the trail, which varied from packed earth that was almost civilized to loose sandy stretches where cattle sank to their knees. She noted which drovers performed which functions, which cattle gave trouble, which sections of the route were prone to which problems. She wrote it all down in the ledger books Homer had supplied, in her precise schoolteacher's hand, and every evening she would go over the day's notes with him at the chuck wagon while the cook, a man named Alejandro who was Mexican and who had been with Homer for 7 years, and who treated Gertrude with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that the trail boss would not tolerate discourtesy, produced whatever combination of beans, salt pork, and cornbread could be assembled from the available supplies. Those evenings were when she began to know him. It was not a single revelation but an accumulation of small ones. She noticed that he always ate last, after every drover had been served. She noticed that, when there was trouble, he went toward it rather than sending someone else, and that this was not bravado but simply his understanding of where the responsibility lay. She noticed that he knew the names of every one of his 22 drovers, not just their names but the particulars of their situations, their family circumstances, their skills and weaknesses, and that he used this knowledge not to manipulate but to deploy people where they would be most effective and least likely to be harmed. She noticed that he slept less than anyone else. She was often awake at odd hours, roused by the sounds of the cattle or the unfamiliar immensity of the night sky, and she would see him moving through the camp in the darkness, checking the night watch, checking the remuda, simply walking the perimeter of what was his responsibility. "You do not sleep," she said to him one night, 7 weeks into the drive. She had been unable to rest and had come to sit by the dying fire, and he had materialized out of the dark in that way that never quite startled her anymore. "I sleep enough," he said, settling into the grass a few feet away. "That is almost certainly not true," she said. He was quiet a moment. "Trail boss sleeps when the herd is settled and the men are rested," he said. "It is not a rule anyone wrote down, it is just how it works." "Does it have to work that way?" He looked at her sidelong. The firelight caught the silver at his temples. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are those the rules because the work requires them, or are they the rules because you set them for yourself?" Another pause, longer this time. "You ask strange questions, Miss Finley." "Gertrude," she said for about the 4th time. She had been asking him to use her given name for 3 weeks. He kept reverting to the formal address, and she had begun to suspect it was not forgetfulness. "Gertrude," he said, and the way he said it was different, more careful, like he was putting weight on something he was still testing. "I think those two things are hard to separate, but not impossible." "No," he admitted, "not impossible." She watched the coals. He watched the dark beyond the firelight where the cattle moved occasionally, the massive shapes of them shifting against the sky. She had stopped being afraid of them somewhere around week 3. "You could not be afraid of something you lived alongside without pause. The men respect you enormously," she said. "I pay them well and I keep them alive," Homer said. "Respect follows from that mostly." "That is not all of it," she said. "Old Pete looks at you the way my students used to look at problems they genuinely wanted to solve, like you matter beyond your function." He did not answer that. He was uncomfortable with it, she could see, and she filed this away. Homer Shepard received compliments about his professional competence without difficulty. He received anything that spoke to his personal worth with an almost pained deflection. The trouble began at the Red River crossing in late July. The Red River was always difficult, Homer had explained before they reached it. The river ran red from iron in the soil, and it ran wide and shallow in dry seasons and narrow and catastrophically fast in wet ones, and the summer of 1879 had been neither fully dry nor fully wet, which meant the crossing was unpredictable. He had crossed the Red River 14 times in his career. He knew its moods better than most people knew their own families. What he had not accounted for was the fact that another outfit had crossed 2 days ahead of them and had broken the northern bank in a way that made the approach treacherous. 3 drovers from the other outfit had drowned. Homer learned this from a rider coming south and called a halt while he and 2 of his most experienced men rode ahead to assess the situation. Gertrude went with them. He did not invite her, but he did not tell her to stay either, and she took this as permission. The river was fast and red and ugly. She could see where the bank had been torn up, great chunks of dark earth missing, the grass roots hanging exposed like broken bones. Homer dismounted and stood at the edge for a long time, reading something in the water that she could not interpret. "We can take them over 2 miles east," one of his men said. A drover named Caleb, young and competent and very serious. "The bank looks better there. 2 miles east puts us in quicksand on the south side," Homer said. "Learned that in '74. Then we wait." Homer turned and looked south toward where 3,000 cattle were holding in a grass flat that would only sustain them for another day and a half. Then he looked east. Then he looked at the river. "We can take them over here," he said. "But we need to rebuild the bank approach first. I need 12 men with shovels in 4 hours." Caleb looked at the sky, which had a yellowish quality she was learning to distrust. "Weather coming," he said. "I know," Homer said. "That is why we need 12 men in 4 hours and not 12 men in 5 hours." The next 4 hours were extraordinary. Gertrude documented it all, riding back and forth between the work site and the herd, noting the men employed, the methods used, the time elapsed. Homer worked alongside his drovers, not supervising from horseback but in the dirt himself, moving earth with a shovel and with his hands, building a gradual slope down to the water line that the cattle could manage. He directed and he labored simultaneously, which she gathered was not how all trail bosses operated. The crossing took another 3 hours, conducted in sections of 500 cattle at a time to keep the weight on the rebuilt bank manageable. Homer was in the water for most of it, on horseback at first and then, when one of the lead steers balked and threatened to turn the whole section back on itself, off his horse and in the river to his chest, moving the animal forward with nothing but his hands and his voice, and an iron refusal to let the animal's panic become his own. When it was done and the last of the herd was across, and the storm that had been threatening finally broke in a furious curtain of rain, Gertrude found herself sitting in her saddle in the downpour watching Homer stand at the river's edge with water streaming off his hat brim, and she thought, with a clarity that alarmed her, that she was in very serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble you could document in a ledger book. She wrote nothing in the ledger that evening about the feeling that had settled somewhere behind her breastbone while she watched him in that river. She was a precise and honest record keeper, but some things did not belong in the official record. Not yet. What she did write about was the crossing itself, and it was some of the best writing she had ever done, concrete and vivid and honest about both the danger and the resolution. She showed it to Homer later, when the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle and the camp was settling into an exhausted quiet, and he read it standing beside the chuck wagon with a lantern held up, his clothes still damp, his face doing something complicated. "You made it sound like I knew what I was doing," he said. "You did know what you were doing," she said. "I was frightened the entire time," he said, and then he seemed to catch himself as if he had said more than he intended. She looked at him carefully. "Good," she said. "Fear is information. The problem is when you cannot act despite it. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said nothing, but he did not take it back, which she thought was significant. The drive continued south through August and into September. They moved through the Cherokee Nation, and Homer navigated those relationships with the same careful attention he brought to every other aspect of the work, dealing honestly with the traders and leaders they encountered, paying the agreed toll without argument, treating the arrangement as the legitimate transaction it was rather than the inconvenience some other outfits apparently viewed it as. She watched him at these negotiations and wrote about them too, in her letters to Hubert Marsh at the Chronicle, who published an edited version that generated, Hubert informed her by the next mail relay, considerable discussion. She fell in love with Homer Shepard sometime in August, somewhere on the plains of Indian Territory, under a sky so enormous it made you feel both very small and very much part of something that mattered. She could not point to the specific moment. It was not the Red River, though that had shaken something loose. It was not any single conversation, though their conversations were accumulating into something that felt like the most important ongoing event in her life. It was all of it together, the way he held his responsibility, the way he listened to her without the slightly strained patience she was used to from men who were waiting for their turn to speak, the way he laughed when she made him laugh, which was a surprised laugh, like laughter was something that happened to him rather than something he did on purpose. She did not tell him. She was not sure he would receive it well, and she was not sure what form of telling would be appropriate given that she was in his employ, and they were in the middle of what was functionally a wilderness. She had her self-respect, and she had her work, and she had approximately 300 miles still to travel, and she thought perhaps she should arrive at the destination before she said anything that could not be unsaid. But she catalogued him. She catalogued him the way she catalogued everything else, with precision and without sentimentality, noting the way he moved and the way he thought, and the way he handled every unexpected thing the trail threw at them. There were many unexpected things. A grass fire in late August that required the entire outfit to work through the night building a fire break. A drover, a young man named Samuel who was 18 years old and who had told her early in the drive that he had sent his first month's wages home to his mother in Tennessee, who contracted a fever and had to be transported in the supply wagon for 5 days, while Homer adjusted the entire operation to accommodate his absence. A confrontation with a competing outfit over a shared water source that Homer resolved with a firmness that stopped just short of violence, and a fairness that she could see the other trail boss did not quite believe was genuine. She talked with him about all of it. That was perhaps what she had not expected, that he would talk to her, not report to her, not explain himself to her, but actually talk, as one person thinks out loud with another. He told her about the decisions he made and why he made them. Sometimes he asked what she thought, and when she told him, he listened to the whole of it before responding, and sometimes he changed his view and sometimes he did not, but he always took her seriously. "You are going to keep writing," he said to her one evening about 6 weeks from the end of the drive. "After this is over, you are going to write something bigger than the Chronicle." "I do not know that," she said. "I do," he said. "I have been watching you think. The way you think is not the way people think when they are writing newspaper articles. You are collecting something larger." She was startled because he was right and she had not said it to anyone. She was collecting something larger. She was not sure yet what to call it. "You see people clearly," she said to him. "You knew that about me from watching." "It is useful in my work," he said, the deflection again, the slight drawing back. She had catalogued all of his deflections by this point and could identify them with accuracy. "Homer," she said. He looked at her. "I am going to ask you something, and I am asking it because I want to know the answer, not because I am writing it down anywhere." His expression shifted, became more careful. "All right. What does this actually cost you?" She gestured at the camp around them, at the space they occupied, at the whole enterprise. "Not boots, not months. What does it actually cost?" He was very still for a long moment. The fire burned between them. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote made its sound. The cattle moved like dark water at the edge of perception. "More than I have said to anyone," he said at last. "I know," she said quietly. "I have been watching you sleep less than anyone else and eat last and make every decision carry the full weight of your attention. And I have been watching what happens at the end of the day when all of that is done, and there is no more work to absorb the cost of it." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and for a moment she thought he might simply close again, go back behind the careful professional surface. Then something shifted in his face, something that looked like surrender, not the defeated kind but the deliberate kind, the choice to set something down. "I have driven cattle since I was 19, he said. "Started as a drover, worked up to ramrod, took over my first drive as boss when I was 28. And every year I have gotten better at the driving, and I have gotten more decorations and more respect from the buyers and the ranchers and the other outfits. And every year when the drive ends and the men go back to their families and I go back to a hotel room in whatever town is at the end of the trail, I sit in that room and I cannot quite remember what I am for when there are no cattle to move." The fire crackled. She did not speak. She had learned that he required space to finish things. "I have told myself it is simply the nature of the work," he said. "That the loneliness is the price of independence, and that independence is worth the price. And I have believed that more or less. But I am 37 years old, Gertrude, and I have not told the truth about the cost of it to a single human being in 18 years, and I think that is also a cost. I think that might be the largest cost of all." The words arrived in her chest like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. "It is," she said. "It is the largest cost. Because it compounds." He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had suspected but not been able to name. She did not say anything else that night about love. She was not a reckless person, and she understood that Homer Shepard, who was careful about everything, would need to arrive at things in his own time. But when she went to her bedroll later and lay looking at the stars, she felt a certainty about the future that she had not felt since she was a child, and the future had seemed like a simple promise the world was making. The drive reached the home ranch in Texas in the second week of September. The ranch belonged to the Halcyon Cattle Company, a partnership between three men who were all richer than God and who treated Homer with the elaborate respect of employers who know they need someone more than he needs them. Gertrude completed the final accounts and the official drive report, which ran to 47 pages and which the senior partner, a man named Bradford Walsh, read in its entirety and then looked at Homer over the top of it and said, "Where has this woman been all our lives?" Homer had looked at Gertrude when Walsh said this. Just looked at her for a fraction of a second, and what was in his look was something she did not have a ledger category for. She had a room at the ranch for the week she needed to complete the final paperwork. Homer had his own quarters, a single room that was larger than a bunk and smaller than anything you could call comfortable, furnished with a cot and a table and a window that faced the open range. She knew this because he had shown it to her on the brief tour of the ranch house he had given when they arrived, with no particular comment about the room's bareness. She was thinking about that bareness, and about what he had told her by the fire, and about the 18 years of not telling the truth about the cost when she found the box. She had not been snooping. She had been in the ranch's small office completing the accounts when Bradford Walsh had asked her to locate the previous year's drive records, which were filed somewhere in the office. And in the process of looking, she had opened a cedar box that was on the top shelf and found, instead of records, a collection of every citation and medal Homer had earned in 18 years of trail driving. They were all there. 11 medals, 14 certificates of commendation, 7 letters from cattle association presidents, 3 from territorial governors. The box was not hidden exactly, but it was not displayed either. It was filed away, out of sight, in the same way a person might file away evidence of something they were proud of, but also, at some level, could not entirely look at. The next afternoon she found herself at the saloon in the small town near the ranch, where Homer and his drovers had come to celebrate the end of the drive. She had the box with her, which in retrospect was an impulse she had not fully examined before acting on it. She had meant to show it to him quietly, to say something thoughtful and private about what she had found and what she thought it meant. Instead, she had been standing there with the medal in her hand, and he had said something, some deflecting, diminishing thing about the drive and what it cost, and the medal had simply fallen from her fingers. And now they were here, in the saloon, in the silence that had formed around something true. Homer Shepard looked at the medal on the bar beside her water glass for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I should have told you before I asked you to join the drive." She waited. "The Cimarron Crossing," he said. "In '77, there was a flood. Flash flood came without warning. I was pushing the herd through to make time, which is what you do, because time is money and delay means the grass is used up and the cattle lose weight, and we lost 4 men in that crossing. 4 of my men. 2 of them were younger than the drive was long. They were 19 and 20 years old, and I had decided we were going to cross that day, and the decision was mine alone, and they are dead." She stood very still. "The decoration from '78, he said, and his voice was even, but the effort of keeping it even was visible, the tightness at his jaw, the controlled steadiness of his breathing. "The one you were holding, that was the year after. The year where I rebuilt my reputation and proved I was still the best trail boss in the territory, which I did because I could not sit with what the Cimarron had cost. I could not sit still with it. So I worked, and I got better and better and more decorated, and every decoration went in that box, and the box went on the shelf, and nobody ever asked me what it cost." Gertrude felt the weight of it press against her sternum like something physical. She thought about 4 men. She thought about 2 of them being 19 and 20 years old. She thought about Homer Shepard putting that in a cedar box and working harder and harder and sleeping less and less. "You made a decision in good faith," she said. "Trail bosses cannot predict flash floods." "I know that," he said. "I know it here." He touched 2 fingers briefly to his temple. "It does not live there, though. It lives somewhere else." "I know," she said. "I should have told you," he said. "Before you joined the drive, you were asking the right question from the beginning, and I gave you the easy answer because I did not want you to see it. Because by the time you asked it, I already did not want you to think less of me." The saloon was very quiet. The sunlight came through the dusty window and made a gold bar across the floor between them. "Homer," she said. He looked at her. There was something in his face that she recognized as the same thing she had felt when she had opened the latch on Mabel's letter and begun making arrangements to come west. It was the look of someone who had gotten to the edge of something and was preparing for whatever came next. "I have spent the last 4 months watching you be the best at what you do," she said, "and the best version of who you are. And I know the difference between those 2 things, because you are not always the same thing as the best trail boss in the territory. Sometimes you are just Homer Shepard, who does not sleep enough and carries other people's well-being like it is a debt he owes rather than a choice he makes. And that man, the one who said he could not remember what he was for when the drive was over, that man is the one I want to sit across a fire from for the rest of my life." Homer Shepard, the most decorated trail boss in the territory, stood perfectly still in the gold light of a Texas saloon and said absolutely nothing. But his face did something she had never seen it do in 4 months of watching. It let something go. Something he had been holding so long it had become part of his structure, and when it let go, his shoulders dropped half an inch and his eyes lost some of their perpetual vigilance, and he looked, just briefly, like a man who could imagine not being at war with the cost of things. "I do not know how to do this," he said, "not the trail driving." She understood he meant the other thing. "Neither do I," she said. "I have been doing an extremely poor job of not falling in love with you for approximately 2 months. Something moved in his face that was the beginning of a smile. "I have been doing an extremely poor job of the same thing for approximately the same period," he said. Old Pete at the bar made a sound that was half cough and half laugh and was definitely neither, and the barkeep found an urgent reason to go into the back room. Gertrude and Homer looked at each other across the small distance between them, and she thought, precisely and clearly, that this was what she had come west for. Not the frontier, not the adventure, not the proving of herself, though she had done all of those things. This specific human being who was standing in the gold light looking at her like she had somehow resolved a question he had given up on. He reached out and took her hand, just held it in both of his, which were large and were cruffined and warm, and said her name again. Just her name, Gertrude, the way he always said it, low and careful, like something worth handling well. "I would very much like to know you for the rest of my life," he said, "if that is something you are willing to consider." "I am not considering it," she said. "I have already decided." The winter of 1879 and into 1880 was a period that Gertrude would later think of as the Great Uncovering. She stayed in Texas, which had not been her original plan, but the original plan had been made by a person who did not yet know Homer Shepard, and that felt like a lifetime ago. She found work with a newspaper in San Antonio, which was close enough to the ranch that she could make the journey by stage when she wanted to, and she went every second weekend and sometimes in between, and Homer rode up to San Antonio on Thursdays when the ranch work allowed, and what happened between them in that time was, she thought, the most important education of her life, because it was an education in another person's interior. He was not easy to know. Not because he was withholding, but because he was genuinely complex in a way that revealed itself slowly, like the plains in spring, where the grass comes up in layers, and you keep finding something new underneath. He was precise and methodical in his thinking and felt things with a depth that he had spent years learning to root around. He had been raised on a farm in Tennessee, the second of 5 children, by parents who were practical people with no particular vocabulary for the inner life. He had come west at 19 because he had a restlessness that the farm could not contain, which he had thought for a long time was simple ambition, and which he was beginning, she could see, to understand as something more complicated. A search for something, a trying to locate himself in relation to something large enough to justify the effort. She told him equally uncomfortable truths about herself. That she had come west partly running away, not just toward. That Gerald Whitmore, the hollow man she had almost married, had been hollow partly because she had filled him with her own expectations and then been disappointed when he could not sustain them. That she had a tendency to make herself indispensable to situations as a way of ensuring she could not be easily removed from them, which was a kind of emotional security system she had built after her father's death, and which she was not entirely sure served her well. Homer listened to all of this with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. He asked good questions. He did not rush to reassure her, which she appreciated because reassurance without understanding was just noise. They talked about the Cimarron crossing more than once. Not in the way you prod a wound, but in the way you examine a scar, understanding its shape and origin. He had written letters to the families of the 4 men he had lost, letters that had taken him 3 weeks to write and that he still did not know had been adequate. He had put money in trust for the 2 youngest men's families, anonymously because anything he attached his name to felt too much like purchasing absolution, and he did not believe he deserved absolution. He believed he deserved to carry it forward and make different decisions. "You do not believe in forgiveness?" she asked him once. "I believe in it," he said. "I believe other people can forgive. I am not sure the dead ones can, and I find I cannot locate peace with it until they could." She sat with this. It was the kind of logic that was both unreasonable and completely coherent, and she did not try to argue him out of it. Instead, she said, "Then carry it and let it inform the decisions you make and live in a way that would have been worth something to the people who are no longer living." He looked at her. "You are possibly the most direct person I have ever met." "I was a school teacher," she said. "You cannot be indirect with children. They see through it immediately." He smiled, the real smile, not the deflecting one. The real one reached his eyes and changed his whole face. She had been collecting those smiles since August, and she was becoming a connoisseur of them. He proposed to her in February of 1880, not with particular ceremony, which was appropriate because neither of them was a person who required ceremony. He was at the newspaper office in San Antonio on a Thursday, and she had finished her work for the day, and they were walking along the river in the last of the afternoon light, and he stopped walking and turned to her and said, "I would like to marry you, Gertrude. I would like to make a home with you and drive cattle that finance that home and come back to you at the end of every drive and tell you the actual true cost of it, without the boots and the month's version, if you will have me." She had taken his face in her hands, which he had not been expecting, and held it and looked at him carefully for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I will have." They were married in March of 1880 in a small ceremony at a church in San Antonio. Gertrude's cousin Mabel came from back east and wept in a way that suggested she was claiming some credit for the outcome, which was generous of her. Old Pete stood up with Homer and cried steadily throughout the whole ceremony without any apparent embarrassment. Alejandro, the cook, prepared the wedding supper, and it was the best food Gertrude had ever eaten in her life, which she told him, and he received this with the dignity of a man who has always known his work is exceptional. Homer wore his medals on the ribbon across his chest, which she had suggested, and when she had suggested it, he had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "All right." Not because he wanted to display them, she knew, but because she had asked, and because they were part of the truth of who he was, both the honors they represented and the cost they had accumulated, and she wanted him to marry her as his whole self, not the edited version. She thought about the cedar box on the shelf when she looked at them. She thought about 18 years of putting things away. She thought about a man alone in a hotel room at the end of a drive, unable to quite locate his purpose. She was not under any illusion that love was sufficient to dissolve the dark past of a man who had driven himself in complicated and punishing ways for nearly 2 decades. But she thought that love was the condition under which a person could begin to do that dissolving themselves, if they were willing, and Homer Shepard was, she had determined by this point, profoundly willing. The spring drive of 1880 was the first one she made as his wife. She sat in the records roll again, but differently now. They talked at the end of each day not just about the logistics but about everything. She continued her writing, dispatching pieces to the San Antonio paper, and to a new connection she had made in Kansas City whose magazine was interested in long-form accounts of the cattle industry from a perspective that included the actual human cost of the enterprise. Homer read everything she wrote. He had opinions about it, useful ones, and she took them seriously. It was on this drive, crossing through the Cherokee Nation, that she met the woman who would become one of her closest friends. She was a Cherokee woman named Aileen, who was married to one of the Cherokee leaders involved in the toll negotiations, and who had an interest in documentation and literacy that mirrored Gertrude's own. They met over the course of 3 evenings while the toll was being arranged, and Gertrude left with a promise to correspond, which she kept for the next 30 years. The drive north was free of major disaster, which Homer explained was simply luck and not to be counted on repeating itself. There was a dry stretch in Kansas that was more difficult than expected and required a reroute that added 4 days, and there was a conflict between 2 of the younger drovers that Homer addressed with firm clarity, and the threat of immediate dismissal, which resolved it. Samuel, the young drover who had been ill the previous year, was back and healthy, and performing at a level that made Homer describe him to Gertrude as a future trail boss, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. They reached Abilene in July. Gertrude stopped by the Chronicle office and found Hubert Marsh exactly as she had left him, buried in papers and in need of coffee, and she sat down and they talked for 2 hours about journalism and the West and the way stories got told and who got to tell them. When she came out, Homer was leaning against the wall across the street, his arms crossed, watching her with an expression that she was by now fluent in reading. That one was contentment, the private, quiet kind. "You look like someone who is exactly where they should be," he said when she crossed the street to him. "I feel like it," she said, "though Hubert needs someone full-time desperately. Are you considering it?" "Not right now," she said. "Ask me again in a year." He looked at her carefully, the way he looked at things he was assessing for information. "Is there a reason for the year?" She met his look steadily. "There is." His face changed. She watched understanding arrive in it, moving through those gray eyes like weather moving across the plains, and then his face did something it did not do often. It became completely unguarded. Every controlled, careful surface fell away, and what was underneath was so open and undefended that she felt it like something physical. "Gertrude," he said, just her name. "In January," she said. "I think January." He reached out and pulled her to him in the middle of the main street of Abilene, Kansas, in the full midday sun, which was not characteristic of Homer Shepard, who did not generally conduct personal business in public spaces. She felt his arms around her, and his face bent to her hair, and his whole body was shaking slightly. The controlled, contained kind of trembling that she associated with the moments when emotion exceeded what his practiced steadiness could fully hold. "Careful," she said quietly, laughing. "The cattle buyers will see you." "Let them," he said, which was about the most radical thing he had ever said. Their son was born in January of 1881. On a night when the temperature had dropped sharply, and the wind was coming off the plains with the earnest commitment of something that meant business. Homer had been at the ranch and had ridden hard to reach the house in San Antonio, arriving an hour before the birth, which Gertrude had told him calmly and repeatedly was fine. She had the doctor, and she had the neighbor woman, and she was not in any danger, and he had arrived anyway covered in trail dust and slightly wild-eyed, which was the only time she had ever seen him look that way. They named the boy James Arthur Shepard, for Homer's father, who had died when Homer was 25, and for Gertrude's father, who had died when she was 22, and both of them understood that naming a child for the dead was not only grief, but also something like offering the child to a longer story. James was a serious baby, which seemed right. He had Homer's gray eyes and Gertrude's dark hair, and an expression in his first weeks that suggested he was thinking hard about things, which made his father laugh every time. Homer's laugh around James was the surprised kind, the kind that happened to him, and Gertrude watched it and thought about how love opens things in a person that time and work and even grief have sealed. She wrote a long piece that summer for the Kansas City magazine about what the cattle drives were, and what they cost and what they produced, not just in beef, but in the people who did the work. She wrote about Homer without using his name, which he had requested, but she wrote about him honestly, about the metal box and the sleeplessness and the Cimarron crossing, and the way the best trail boss in the territory had also been, for a long time, a man who could not quite remember what he was for when the work was done. She wrote about the question she had asked him in the saloon in Abilene on the first day they met, and about the answer he had given, and about the true answer he had eventually told her by a fire on the open plain. The piece ran in September of 1881 and created more correspondence than anything she had written before. Letters came from drovers and from their families and from ranchers and from cattle buyers and from people who had no connection to the industry at all but who recognized, in the account she had written, something about work and cost and the danger of never being asked the real question. Homer read the piece in the sitting room of the San Antonio house with James asleep in his arms and did not speak for a long time after he finished it. "This is the something larger," he said at last. "I think it might be," she said. "You should write the whole thing," he said. "The book, you have been gathering material for 2 years. I have a 10-month-old, she said. "James is an excellent sleeper," Homer said, "and I will be here more this winter. I have told Bradford Walsh I am only doing 1 more full season." She looked at him. You have not told me that. I am telling you now." He looked back at her steadily with the gray eyes that she had spent 2 years learning to read. "I am 39 years old, Gertrude. I have been trail bossing for 20 years. I have enough money saved that we could live comfortably for the rest of our lives without another drive. And the ranch itself offers management work that does not require me to be gone 4 months every year. And James is going to grow up, and I do not want to miss the majority of it because I am moving cattle across the plains." She was quiet for a moment, processing this. "This is not because of me," she asked. "You are not giving up something you need because of me." "I am not giving up something I need," he said. "I am choosing something I need more. That is the difference." She thought about what he had said by the fire, about not being able to remember what he was for when the drive was over. She thought about what the last 2 years had done to that. She thought about James Arthur Shepard asleep in his father's arms with Homer's gray eyes closed in trust. "All right," she said. "All right." He was checking because she was not someone who agreed without understanding. "All right," she said again. "You are 39 and you have driven cattle for 20 years and you have earned the right to be at home, and I would very much like you at home, and that is my complete and honest position on the matter." He smiled. The real smile, the one that had taken her months to earn. "Good," he said. The spring drive of 1882 was Homer Shepard's last as trail boss. He organized it with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. But there was something different in him throughout the preparation and the drive itself, something she observed and recorded not in the official ledger, but in her own private notes that were becoming the backbone of the book she was writing. He was still the best at what he did. He was still the person his drovers would follow into the hardest crossing, because they trusted his judgment with a completeness she found moving to witness. But there was a quality of completion about it, a sense that he was doing the thing fully and carefully, and with full knowledge that this was the last time, and bringing to the last time everything he had learned in 20 years. Gertrude did not make this drive. James was 15 months old and she was working on the book in earnest, and the combination made the journey impractical. She and Homer had discussed it at length, and she had found she did not need to go. She trusted him completely, which was different from needing to be present to know what was happening. She wrote and cared for James and corresponded with Aileen and Hubert Marsh and the Kansas City editor, and when the letters came from Homer at the relay stations, she read them 3 times each and kept them in a bundle tied with a strip of cloth. He was back in September. He came into the San Antonio house at 4 in the afternoon, with the dust of the trail still on him, and James, who was now walking and was very interested in everything, made a dash across the sitting room floor at a speed that suggested he had been practicing. And Homer caught him and swung him up and held him against his chest. And Gertrude stood in the doorway between the sitting room and the kitchen, and felt something that had no name except perhaps rightness. The specific quality of things being as they should be. That evening, after James was in his crib, Homer sat at the kitchen table and she sat across from him, and he told her about the drive. He told her all of it. The difficult section through Indian Territory where the grazing had been sparse due to drought. The crossing of the Arkansas River, which had been high this season. The young drover, new to the outfit, who had panicked at the wrong moment and been unhorsed and nearly drowned, and who Homer had pulled out of the current himself. The successful delivery of 2,800 head, 400 fewer than the starting number due to weather, and 1 outbreak of what Alejandro had diagnosed as Texas fever, which was as high a success rate as the conditions could reasonably support. He told her the cost of it, the actual cost, in full. The exhaustion that went into the marrow, the weight of every decision. The 2 nights he had not slept at all because the situation required continuous attention. The conversation he had had with Samuel, who was by now a ramrod of considerable skill, and who had told Homer on the last night of the drive that he was the best trail boss he had ever worked for, and that working for him had made Samuel understand not just how to drive cattle but how to be in charge of other people's lives, and that this conversation had undone Homer in a way the entire drive's physical hardship had not. "Why?" she asked. "Because it meant something was passed on," he said. "The good part of it. Not just the technique, but the understanding that the men matter as much as the cattle, that the cost of the work belongs to the boss, not to the workers, because the boss made the decisions that created the cost." She reached across the table and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers in both of his, the way he had done in the saloon in Texas 2.5 years ago, and looked at her. "I missed you every day," he said. "I know," she said. "I missed you every day too." "It was different this time," he said. "Knowing I was coming home to this, it was very different." She squeezed his hand. "Different how?" "The last day of every other drive," he said slowly, "when the cattle were counted and the money was settled and the men were paid and it was done, I would stand there and feel the drive being over, and there was always a moment, just a moment, where I did not know what was on the other side of the done. Like looking at a page where the writing stops and there is nothing after it." She was very still, listening. "Last night," he said, "when it was done, I stood there and I knew exactly what was on the other side. I knew your face and James's face and this kitchen table. I knew that the cost had somewhere to go. That I could hand it to you and you would look at it straight and say, yes, that is what it cost, and then it would be accounted for and we could put it down and start the next thing." He paused. "I had not known before that that was what I needed, someone to account for the cost, so that it did not simply accumulate into the dark." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. Outside, a night bird made its sound in the warm Texas air. The lantern on the table cast a warm circle around them both. "That is what I am for," she said, "among other things." "Yes," he said, "among other things." She leaned forward and kissed him across the kitchen table, which was awkward, and the chair scraped and the lantern flickered, and she did not care about any of that. He kissed her back, with the same complete attention he brought to every important thing. The following years settled into a shape that neither of them had exactly planned, but that felt, in retrospect, precisely planned by some more intelligent version of themselves. Homer took the ranch management position with Halcyon Cattle Company, which meant he was in San Antonio most of the time, with occasional weeks at the ranch itself. He brought the same systematic intelligence to ranch management that he had brought to trail driving, and Bradford Walsh, who had expected to be condescending about a great trail boss settling for administrative work, found himself instead presiding over a period of remarkable efficiency and profitability, and was eventually gracious enough to admit that Homer Shepard's talents were, if anything, better deployed in a role that did not require him to be absent for 4 months every year. Gertrude's book was published in 1884. It was called The Cost of the Trail, and it was published by a house in New York that had found her Kansas City magazine pieces and written to ask if she was working on something longer. It was the full account, 4 years in the making, of the cattle drive industry as it was lived by the people who did the work. It was not a romantic account in the dime novel sense. It was honest and precise, and it acknowledged the beauty and the brutality with equal attention, and it included a long final section about what the industry did to the men who ran it and the question of who was asking about the cost. The book created a significant response, some of it enthusiastic and some of it hostile, which was what happened when you told the truth about an industry that had powerful interests invested in a particular story of itself. 2 of the large cattle associations formally protested through letters to her publisher. Several newspapers wrote editorials arguing she had exaggerated and romanticized the suffering of drovers. Several others, and a larger number of private letters, said she had told the truth that nobody had bothered to tell before. Homer read every review. He had opinions about all of them. His opinion of the hostile ones was expressed with a deliberate, measured quality that suggested he was choosing not to say the first thing that came to mind. "You do not have to be diplomatic about it," she told him after the second Cattle Association letter was published. "I am not being diplomatic," he said. I am choosing to save my energy for things that are worth it. That is a form of diplomacy, she said. Perhaps, he conceded. They were, by this time, well established in their San Antonio life, in a house large enough to accommodate the accumulation of their books and her papers and his maps and the growing presence of James, who was 3 years old and had developed a strong personality that combined his father's systematic quality with his mother's directness in a way that was occasionally exhausting and consistently delightful. Their second child was born in 1885, a boy they named Thomas, for no one in particular but because they both liked it, and Thomas was from his first hours entirely different from James. Where James was serious and observational, Thomas was immediately, relentlessly cheerful, a quality he maintained through his infancy with a steadiness that suggested it was constitutional. Homer held Thomas on the evening after his birth with an expression that was the most purely uncomplicated Gertrude had ever seen on his face. Love without complexity, without the habitual weight of responsibility. She wrote about that expression in her private notes and thought she might work it into something someday. "You are different with this one," she told him. "I know," he said. He did not explain it, but she understood. James had been born into the last season of the trail driving, into the transition. Thomas had been born into the life they had settled into together, the life that had room in it for things besides the next drive. Homer was not a different man. He was the same man, but without the compulsive motion that had powered him for 20 years. He had found, it seemed, that he knew what he was for when the cattle were not moving. He coached Samuel, who had taken over as trail boss for Halcyon Cattle Company, with the same structured attention that characterized everything he did. Samuel was excellent, but he was young, and the first few drives as senior boss were difficult in ways that had nothing to do with cattle. Homer spent hours with him talking through the decisions, the costs, the methodology of carrying responsibility without being crushed by it. "You are teaching him what you learned," Gertrude observed one evening when Samuel had gone and Homer was sitting on the porch with his coffee. "Trying to," Homer said, "including the cost part." He was quiet. "I told him about the Cimarron," he said. She turned to look at him. This was significant. She knew it was significant because she knew how carefully he had contained the Cimarron, what it had cost him to tell her and what telling her had done. "How did that go?" she said carefully. "He was quiet for a long time," Homer said. "And then he said, 'What did you do after?' And I said I drove harder and better, and I told myself it was atonement, but the truth was it was also avoidance. And Samuel said, 'And now what?' And I said, 'Now I tell people about it instead of building decorations on top of it.'" She set down her coffee cup. "Homer," he looked at her. The porch light was soft and the evening was warm, and somewhere in the yard James and a neighbor child were conducting some kind of serious investigation of a locust, their voices earnest and technical. "It gets lighter," he said. "The Cimarron. Every time I say it out loud it is slightly lighter, not gone. I do not expect it to be gone, but lighter." "Yes," she said, "that is how it works." In 1887, a journalist came from a newspaper in Chicago who was writing a series about the great trail bosses of the Western cattle trade. He was a young man, efficient and ambitious, and he arrived with a list of prepared questions and an assumption that Homer Shepard would want to talk about his career with the promotional enthusiasm of someone building a legacy. He had not read Gertrude's book. This became apparent immediately. Homer met with him in the ranch office, and Gertrude was present because she was curious, and because Homer had asked if she wanted to be, which she had appreciated. The journalist went through his prepared questions, and Homer answered them with courtesy and precision and the practiced public version of himself. The drives completed, the cattle delivered, the record set, the medals earned. The journalist wrote it all down and was preparing to leave when Gertrude said, "You haven't asked about the cost." The journalist looked at her. He had been slightly uncertain about her presence throughout, not quite sure of her role. "I'm sorry. The cost," she said, "of what he does. What it costs a man to drive 3,000 head 800 miles and make every decision that drives of that size require. You've recorded the accomplishments. Have you asked about the price? The journalist looked at Homer. Homer looked at Gertrude with those gray eyes, and in them she could see everything. The fire by the Red River, the cedar box on the shelf, the saloon floor and the falling metal, the kitchen table and the cost that finally had somewhere to go. You should answer that, she said to Homer. Homer turned to the journalist. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding something. Deciding to go past the public version. Deciding, again, to tell the true answer instead of the easy one. The cost is large, he said. And for most of my career I did not tell anyone what it was, because the convention of the work is that you carry it and don't complain, and because I did not have anyone to tell it to. I am going to tell you now, and you should write it, because there are a great many men in this industry who are carrying the same cost alone and who deserve to know that it does not have to be that way. The journalist, to his credit, put down his prepared list and started writing something different. The piece ran in the Chicago paper in October of 1887 and was syndicated to 11 other papers, which was the widest reach Homer Shepard had ever gotten from any of the recognition his career had generated. He received letters for months after, from trail drovers and from former drovers and from their wives and mothers, and from ranch owners and cattle company investors who had never thought to ask their trail bosses what the work cost because it had never occurred to them that the question mattered. Homer answered every letter. It took him through the winter. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and wrote in his precise hand, which was the hand of a man who had kept meticulous records for 20 years, and Gertrude would look up from her own work and watch him and think about everything the trail had been. James was 6 by this time and was developing an intense interest in mathematics and in horses, which Homer was delighted by and which he encouraged with serious attention, teaching the boy to ride properly and explaining the arithmetic of cattle driving with a pedagogical skill that surprised Gertrude, until she realized it should not have surprised her, because Homer Shepard was a man who had spent 20 years transmitting complex knowledge to other people through demonstration and explanation. And that was exactly teaching. Thomas, at 2, was already trying to follow his brother everywhere, which resulted in a certain amount of chaos that both his parents found exhausting in a way that was also simply happiness at a volume they were still learning to manage. In 1889, when Kansas and the neighboring territories were reorganizing under new statehood processes, and the land question was reshaping everything, Gertrude wrote a series of pieces about what was happening to the Cherokee and other nations as the land allotment policies were being imposed. She relied partly on her correspondence with Aileen, who wrote with a clarity and precision about the injustice being done that made Gertrude's own writing on the subject more grounded and specific. The pieces were published in several papers and created a response that was, in the main, hostile from the people who had political and financial interests in the allotment system, and warmly received by everyone else. Homer read them with the careful attention he always brought to her work and said afterward, "You are going to be in trouble with some important people." "I know," she said. "Good," he said. "Important people should be in trouble with you," she laughed. He smiled the real smile, looking at her across the kitchen table with the lantern between them and the sound of the boys sleeping in the back of the house and the night sounds of San Antonio coming through the window. "I am glad you came west," he said. "So am I," she said. "I am glad you asked the right question." She looked at him. "In the saloon, first day." "Yes, I was not ready to answer it then, but it mattered that you asked. I thought about it for weeks afterward. The woman who had asked me what it actually cost. And then I joined your drive and asked it again by a fire on the plains," she said. "And I told you," he said, "parts of it. And then in the saloon you told me the rest," she said. "And then more after that and more after that. It appears to be an ongoing process," he said. "Most of the important ones are," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Outside, the Texas night was warm and wide and full of the sound of things that were alive. James would be 7 in January and Thomas would be 4, and the world they lived in was complicated and often unjust and also lit, Gertrude thought, by specific irreplaceable things. The precise gray of Homer's eyes in the morning, the way he still said her name as if it were worth saying carefully. The cedar box that was no longer on the shelf but was instead open on the mantelpiece, its metals not displayed as a performance but visible as a fact, part of the full truth of who he was and what he had done and what it had cost. She had written the inscription inside the box lid herself, at Homer's suggestion, in her schoolteacher's hand. It said, "Here is what it cost, and here is what it was worth, and both of these things are true." Their third child, a daughter they named Clara after no one but who immediately seemed to have her own very firm ideas about her name and everything else, arrived in 1891. She had Homer's gray eyes and a personality that seemed to have exceeded her parents' combined stubbornness, which they both found alternately alarming and magnificent. James, at 10, was serious and delighted by her. Thomas, at 6, was confident that she was primarily there for his entertainment, an assumption Clara was already, at 3 weeks old, showing signs of intending to correct. Homer's management of the ranch had expanded by this point to encompass not just halcyon San Antonio operations, but a consultancy role with 3 other cattle companies in the territory, which involved him in the larger questions of how the industry was going to adapt as the railroad expanded, and the trail drive as a form became less economical. He approached these questions with the same methodical intelligence he had brought to the trails themselves, and his analysis, which Gertrude helped him organize into a formal document that was published by the Texas Cattle Raisers Association in 1892, was widely credited with influencing how several major ranching operations navigated the transition. She was working on her second book by this time, which was about women in the Western territories and the specific quality of their experience, which was neither the romantic frontier adventure of the dime novels nor the pure suffering of the poverty narratives, but something more complicated and more interesting than either, which was what things always were when you looked at them directly instead of through the lens of what you expected to find. She dedicated it to Homer. The dedication read, "To H.S. who asked the right questions back." When she showed him the dedication page before the book went to press, he read it and was quiet for a moment, and she watched his face do the thing it did when emotion exceeded his practiced steadiness. He looked up at her. "I did not know that I had done that," he said. "You have always done that," she said. "From the Chronicle office in Abilene, when you figured out what I was thinking before I had said it. You asked the right questions back. That is not a small thing." "No," he said. "I suppose it is not." James turned 18 in 1899 and announced his intention to go to university, which both his parents encouraged with the warm completeness of people who had always understood that their children's lives were their own to navigate. Thomas, at 14, was showing a talent for the practical management of animals and land that was unmistakably his father's inheritance, and Clara, at 8, was, in Homer's words, the most formidably opinionated person he had ever known, which from Homer Shepard was the highest possible praise. The house in San Antonio had accumulated, over nearly 20 years, the dense particular texture of a life fully lived. Books everywhere, in no organization that made sense to anyone but their owner. Maps on the walls, some of them annotated in Homer's hand, marking routes and crossings and distances that were now historical. Gertrude's papers stacked in the study in piles that were organized by a system she could navigate perfectly, and that no one else could. A mantelpiece with the open cedar box, and beside it, in the past several years, the letters she had received about her books, pinned there not as trophies, but as evidence that asking the true question mattered. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, in March of 1900, they sat on the porch of the San Antonio house with the Texas night spread out before them, and a quiet that was the quiet of a house that had been settled and full and was now, with the children grown or growing, settling toward the next shape. 20 years, Homer said. Approximately 6 months since you started being willing to use my given name, she said. He made a sound that was laughter. I used it the first day. You used it twice, and then you went back to Miss Finley for 2 months. I was being appropriate, he said. You were being careful, she said. The way you are with things that matter. He looked at her. The light was good, a warm evening light, and she could see him clearly, the way she had been able to see him clearly since approximately the 6th week of that first drive, when the careful professional surface had begun to have a translucency that let the person underneath show through. He was 58 years old now, the silver at his temples long since overtaken his dark hair entirely, and the lines in his face were the lines of weather and work, and, in the past 20 years, significant amounts of laughter. He was still the same man who had brought 3,000 longhorns into Abilene on a Tuesday in May and ridden like he had been born in the saddle. He was also something more now, something that he had not been and that she did not claim credit for creating but did think she had helped clear the ground for. He was a man who knew what he was for. I am going to tell you something, he said. Tell me, she said. When you asked me the first time, in the saloon in Abilene, what it costs, I gave you the easy answer, and then I went back to the hotel and lay awake for an hour thinking about the fact that someone had asked the real question and I had deflected it, and feeling something that I could not name. I know now what it was. It was the feeling of having been close to being genuinely known and having stepped back from it, and that felt like a loss even though I had only known you for 4 hours. She was quiet. The night moved around them. 4 hours, she said. I had decided by then that you were not temporary, he said, which I told you. I had not admitted to myself what else I had decided. What else had you decided? He looked at her steadily. That if there was going to be a person who would ask the real questions and wait for the real answers, I would not know what to do about it, but I was not going to avoid it. She reached over and took his hand. His hand wrapped around hers. They sat in the warm Texas night, in the life they had built from a question asked across a saloon table in Abilene, and the stars came out one by one above them in the enormous western sky. I have a question, she said. Ask it, he said. What does it cost, she said, to be happy? He thought about this with the seriousness he brought to everything. She watched him think and loved him for it, for the fact that he did not give the easy answer, never, not to her, not anymore. It costs the willingness to let someone see what it actually is, he said at last. The happiness and the rest of it, the cost and the worth and the dark and the lit parts. It costs the willingness to be known. And it is worth every cent. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Above them the stars were the same stars that had been above them on the open plain 20 years ago, when they were both learning what they were willing to risk. And the night had the same immensity, and she felt, as she had felt then, both very small and very much part of something that mattered. They sat there for a long time, talking sometimes and quiet sometimes, and the quiet was the same as the talk. It was the quiet of people who had told each other the true cost of things, and found that the accounting, done honestly and together, always came out in the light. Homer Shepard, the most decorated trail boss in the territory, put his face against his wife's dark hair and breathed out slowly. The weight he had carried for 20 years before she asked the right question was not gone. It had not evaporated, but it had been handed over and handed back so many times in 20 years of honest accounting that it had become something different. It had become part of the story they told together. Part of the record she kept with the same precision she had always kept records, accurately and without sentimentality, and with full attention to what was true. She reached up without looking and put her hand over his. He held it. The cattle drives were over now, mostly. The railroad had made the long drives obsolete, which was a fact Homer tracked with the same careful attention he brought to everything, noting not just the economic reality, but the human one. The men who had spent their lives on the trail were finding different work, and some of them were finding it hard to make the transition from the particular kind of motion that the drives required to the different kind of being that ordinary life asked for. He wrote to several of them. He answered their letters. He told them what he had learned, which was that the hardest crossing was not the Red River or the Cimarron, but the one from the person you were when you were in motion to the person you could be when you were still. Gertrude wrote about that too. She was working on her third book, which was about the end of the trail drive era and the men who had lived it, and Homer was her primary source and her first reader and her most rigorous critic, which was the same thing he had always been, which was the person who asked the right questions back. James wrote from the university in Austin, where he was studying law with the same systematic intensity that characterized everything about him. Thomas had taken over significant portions of the ranch management work under Homer's mentorship and was proving, as Homer had said years ago about a different young man named Samuel, that he understood not just the work but the responsibility of being in charge of other people's lives. Clara at 9 was already editing Gertrude's manuscripts without being asked, appearing at her elbow with the unnerving confidence of someone who had always known exactly what she was about, and leaving margin notes in her careful child's hand that were, Gertrude had to admit, frequently correct. They were, all of them, part of the story that had started with a question in a saloon in Abilene in May of 1879. A woman with a carpetbag and $43, and a question she asked because she had learned that the easy answer was almost never the true one. A man with 20 years of trail and 11 medals, and a cedar box on a shelf and 18 years of not being asked what it actually cost. The question and the answer and everything that had grown from both of them, slowly and with effort, and with all the honesty that either of them had in them, which was considerable. Homer looked up at the stars. Gertrude looked at him. 20 years, she said again, and another 20, he said. At minimum, she said. He turned and looked at her. In the warm light, his eyes were exactly the gray they had always been, the gray of the sky before a storm, and in them now there was no storm, only the clarity that comes after, the kind of seeing that requires having weathered something together and come out the other side. At minimum, he agreed. She kissed him on the cheek. He caught her hand before she could pull it back and held it to his face for a moment, the rough skin of his hand against the back of hers, and the contact was the same as it had always been. Careful, like something worth handling well, like something he was not going to let go of. The cedar box sat on the mantelpiece inside, its metals catching the light through the window. The ledger books from 20 years of drives were stacked in the study beside her manuscripts. The children were in the house or in the world, and the world was complicated and unjust and also specific and lit, and worth every cost it had ever asked of either of them. The most decorated trail boss in the territory sat on a porch in Texas in the spring of 1900 with his wife's hand in his, and breathed in the night air of a life that had finally, in every particular that mattered, told the truth about what it cost, and found that what it was worth was larger. Outside the porch, the Texas stars burned in their ancient configurations, indifferent to the small warm light below them, indifferent to the man and woman who had crossed the hardest terrain there was and arrived somewhere worth arriving, indifferent to everything except the fact that they were here, and they were still, and they were known. Which was, as Gertrude Finley Shepard had always understood and Homer Shepard had finally come to agree, more than enough.